Now, again, if you're watching this podcast, you're realizing that I keep finding this guy popping up, Aleister Crowley, the occult. We talked about NASA, how this religion he established called Thelema became not just mainstream amongst the elites. I mean, they didn't even care. They were just throwing sexual rituals trying to summon demons. And the fact that this information is freely available on the web and the majority of us don't know it, to me, is a bit of a conspiracy, right? The fact that he was welcomed in polite society, was loved and adored by elite politicians in the West. It should make us go, what's really going on here? I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I know I'm having way too much fun. I have to stop.
I'd have to say overall that Aleister Crowley actually turns out, comparison to a lot of other characters, will get to be reasonably honest. Because when he said that he was working for the British government in America during World War I, it turns out he was telling the truth. And I'll come back to that in just a minute. But I was wondering, could there have been, Crowley claims connection to British intelligence. Riley had some kind of connection to it. They're in the same place at the same time. Well, see, I was really looking for stuff about Riley, but I thought I would look to see if I could find any material about Crowley that might connect them. But what I did was I wrote off to the U.S. National Archives, and I was looking through the files of something called the Military Intelligence Division. And the Military Intelligence Division, or the MID, during the First World War, was basically, it wasn't the FBI that handled internal security. That barely existed at the time. It was essentially the Army. It was the MID. And they were in charge of tracking, among other things, enemy spies and subversive activity. I mean, they really like subversive activity. So somehow some things just don't change. But but the thing about it is that what's interesting about the MID records is that they're all declassified. They're one of the few chunks of genuine, raw intelligence material that you can actually get access to. So I wrote off and I basically asked the archivist in Washington, you have any files that deal with Aleister Crowley? Turns out they did. And they sent it to me. Here's the file in question. And here's the part of it that I will read to you. So what happened is that Crowley, this is in the summer of 1918, Crowley's camping on an island in the Hudson River on a magical retreat. He paddled up the Hudson River in a canoe. So he's camping out on this island, and the local officer of the MID, whose job it is to keep an eye on, weirdo foreigners in the area, decides that there's a weirdo foreigner on this island, and he looks into him and he finds out, well, my God, this guy had been writing for a German magazine. He'd been writing anti-British propaganda. Why isn't this guy in jail? So before he arrests Crowley, he makes some inquiries, which is generally what you should do. So one of those inquiries went to the British consulate in New York, and here's basically the reply that they got. Let's see. Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government, but at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. So what's important about that one statement is that it confirms what Crowley later claimed, that he was in the United States on official business for the British government. Now, of course, that still leaves a big question. What official business?
Right. Why? Why were you here?
Yes. What's the rest of the story? And if you tend to look at what Crowley's day-to-day activities, there's no apparent official business for the British government. He's not engaged in trade. He's not connected to the consulate or any British agency. So what's he doing? Well, what he claimed he was doing is that he was engaged. He was essentially acting as a double agent. And as a double agent, what he had been doing is sort of insinuating himself into what was called the German propaganda cabinet in the U.S. So here's one of these little tiresome, pedantic history lessons I have to give people. For most of World War I, the United States was a neutral country. So the war started in 1914. U.S. didn't really come in towards the end, not until the middle of 1917. So Crowley shows up on Halloween 1914. Okay, I don't think he planned it that way. Maybe he did. I don't know. But he shows up on Halloween 1914 in New York, and he spends the whole war in the United States. Okay, so our other guys are off in England doing their bit in the trenches and elsewhere, and he could have been there. He's still physically fit at this time. He's around 40. Okay, he could have qualified. Has some education. There's officer material for you.
Right.
So he could have, lasted his 19 minutes in the trenches, or he was off in the U.S. And you see again why somebody later might argue that was kind of unpatriotic, because for the whole war, you were hanging around in America, apparently engaging in, magical rituals, lots of sex, and drugs. That's what he was doing. So he was roaming around America, apparently having lots of sex, taking lots of drugs, and otherwise engaging in magic.
If you didn't say what years he was born and when he died, I would say, oh, this was the 60s.
Yes, well, that's why he became so popular.
Right.
But he's also, should be credited as one of the great pioneers of recreational drug use. So there we are. But also, for his magical offerings. So Crowley, again, would always argue that, yes, I befriended, and I was befriended by German operatives and propagandists in the U.S., but this was all part of my job. So when you basically look at the official statement, which is that, yeah, he's in America doing something for the British government, we're not going to say what, and then you look at what he's actually doing, it fits in with the pattern, which was fairly familiar now, of an intelligence operative. So keep in mind, you got to be, cautious about the terms you use. So you don't want to say that Crowley was an intelligence officer, because an officer is someone who actually either holds a military commission and does intelligence work, or is employed, a full-time employee of an intelligence agency. There aren't many of those. Officers generally recruit and run assets, what are commonly called agents in this. Those are the people who supply them with information. Right. That's what their job is. And what Riley was doing, putting the pieces, not Riley, but Crowley was doing, see, I'm getting my spies mixed up. What Crowley was up to was, he's an asset. He's there to perform certain functions. So what Crowley was connected to was specifically to British naval intelligence. Crowley basically founded his own religion, Thelema. He believed that he had received a new gospel had been delivered to him, and that he was now going to be the head of this new religion, which didn't quite become the big deal he thought it was going to. But he spent his life promoting that. So he actually, in his own way, became a preacher of the gospel, a different gospel, and thus sort of following in an odd way in his father's footsteps. Where Crowley came in contact with the Naval Intelligence Division, I couldn't give you a specific date for that. It's pretty clear that he's connected to them by around 1910. So again, let's go back. He's born in 1875.
So that's like almost 30 years old.
Almost certainly where he was recruited was, and the kind of recruiting ground for that was Cambridge University.
Okay.
So he never graduated, but he did go to Cambridge. And what you had at Cambridge or at Oxford or elsewhere, then and now, I imagine, is you have people who are spotters. So another way that intelligence recruitment often works is you have people whose whole job, often they're professors, and their job is just to kind of keep a outlook, for someone who might be a likely candidate for clandestine work. You're sort of sizing them up in terms of their interests, their apparent, they seem to be reasonably smart. Do they have? Well, one of the things that might be necessary is that they have a certain degree of moral flexibility. So, I mean, this again is one of the first things that you would be told in British intelligence. You know, one of the things if you're going to do this, you have to be prepared to do two things: lie and kill. Okay? Maybe that won't come up. Maybe you won't have to do those. But if it happens, that's what you have to be willing to do, and you have to do it without hesitation. And this is one of the reasons why you never talk about, even if what you did in intelligence work isn't very important. The thing is that if someone knows you were an agent, they can then begin to piece together who else might have been. Oh, so this guy worked for British intelligence. Well, who did he meet with? Who did he know? What other people might he have brought into this? You see, it opens up this little tiny window. Your little window into how this agency operates. And that's one of the things you always want to keep closed. So one of the things you find with Crowley is whenever he would get frustrated, which I think he did, and would, mention Gaunt or talk too much about his spy work during the war, he'd get his hand slapped.
Huh. Well, I was going to ask you about that, because when did he start getting into the drugs and the orgies and, that he was kind of known for? Because as we know, drinking and drugs and hanging out with your buddies and all kinds of different people, sometimes things slip out.
Sometimes they do, and that's where you have to be careful. Yeah. That's sometimes where you have to look like you have to give everybody else the drugs, and then you don't take them.
Is that like you take the drink, don't sip it, you throw it over your shoulder?
Here's an example of one of those things that Crowley would do. This tells you something about what kind of guy you're dealing with. Crowley apparently made a fairly mean curry. Right? Yeah. He fancied himself a cook, and he would invite people over for dinner. And this was one of the things he did in wartime, the U.S. during World War I. He would invite people over for dinner individually or in groups, and then he would dose their dinner with mescaline.
What's mescaline? I don't know that.
Peyote.
Oh, peyote. Okay.
Synthesized peyote. So he'd, which is, for the uninitiated, is a powerful psychedelic drug. So he would give different doses of this, and then he would sit back and he would watch what happened. He would record their reactions. So remember, you're going to have different people. So you would have men and women, small people, large people, older people, younger people, ideally.
Right.
And then you would see how the same dosage of this drug affected different people. And Crowley felt for some reason he needed to take notes on that. So the question to me is, was he taking notes on this because it had some application to magical workings? I don't quite see that.
Yeah, that's
or did it have application to things like interrogations?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yes, because later on, when you get to things like, MK Ultra and the British before them would use mescaline as one of those drugs that you would try to get people talking. So it's always something to keep in mind. Wherever you are, the drunkest person in the room may not really be the drunkest person in the room. That is, they may be pretending to do one thing or the other. So that's not to say that Crowley didn't ingest drugs on his own. His favorite, by the way, seems to have been ether.
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 Of all things.
Who would have guessed that?
I was going to say, you don't hear that too often.
No, I haven't heard anybody go, let's go get high on ether.
Right.
But, closest equivalent is sniffing glue.
Right.
So, but he preferred that. He did, the one thing that will be noted is that later in life, he was a heroin addict. But interestingly enough, he became a heroin addict through its prescription to him to treat asthma. So one of the things that he suffered from the time he was a child was chronic asthma. And one of the things that, back in the day that doctors would prescribe to deal with, instead of an inhaler, you got some heroin. And apparently it works quite well, but you become hopelessly addicted. So there's that trade-off. So that to me is one of the ironies, is that the drug that Crowley becomes an addict to is not one that actually had any particular application for me. It wasn't the fun drug.
Can you please expand on some of Crowley's influences in pop culture and modern media? How would you answer that question?
It was a British newspaper who, after his seemingly traitorous exploits during the war, who called him the wickedest man in the world. Well, when that first showed up, because he hated the guy who called him that was kind of cool, I mean, hey, you managed to piss off someone you don't like. I could get them to call me who in some way doesn't want to be the wickedest man in the world? Well, the problem is that stuck. And after a while, it becomes burdensome. It becomes the type of thing that it's the stink you can never manage to get off. So when you've spent much of your life essentially thumbing your nose at what might be called society, you're going to strangely find that society holds you in fear and contempt. And now, but on the other hand, what kind of a reputation did that give him by the time we get to the swinging 60s? Well, the swinging 60s was, basically thumbed its nose at existing morality. Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay, everything the squares were doing, we were against. Everybody was going to do their own thing. Everybody was going to be free and sexually liberated and groovy, and we'll enhance that with therapeutic drugs. Well, Crowley had, again, kind of pioneered those things. Now, presented. And that's why you find him embraced by many people, particularly in the music scene. Rock music is full of Crowley fans, and it's not just Jimmy Page.
Because the Beatles even had
the Beatles, but the Beatles probably not as much as groups like the Doors. They were certainly aware of him.
David Bowie,
Led Zeppelin gets brought into this. Ozzy Osbourne's got a whole song about him, so at least he's Crowley curious. I don't know what that means. Right. And he's pretty much everywhere because he was sort of the face of this. Literally, if you were trying to look back, 40 years earlier from the standpoint of the 60s and find somebody who seemed to be this kind of, archetype of social, this kind of social and religious rebel, well, then who better than Aleister Crowley? And furthermore, he's dead and he can never disagree with us.
Right. It's always easy to...
We can exploit him for any purpose and we have to pay him no royalties. So there you go.
Well, I'm curious, did L. Ron Hubbard ever look up to Aleister Crowley? Because it seems like there's still a little bit of L. Ron Hubbard in what he ended up becoming Scientology.
Well... Hubbard, the connection between Crowley and Hubbard, they do have a common connection through a guy by the name of John Whiteside Parsons.
John Whiteside Parsons.
Jack Parsons is what he's generally known. And Jack Parsons is, he was he's usually called a rocket scientist. He's actually a chemist, explosive expert, and an aeronautical engineer. He's one of the founding members of the whole rocket program at Caltech in the 1930s and 1940s. He's the guy that invented, or let's say perfected, solid fuel rocket engines. So therefore, Jack Parsons is one of the pioneers of the American space program. He was a kind of self-taught genius. He really did sort of come up. There's Jack Parsons with a bomb, not his own. But he knew his way around explosives until the day he managed to blow himself up with them. But Jack Parsons was, in addition to being a genius in that regard, he was also a devoted follower of Aleister Crowley. And he came into that. He dabbled in various forms of occultism, got connected with an organization called the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is Crowley's. I'll play it quick and dirty. It's essentially Crowley's secret society, the one that he headed, an initiatory occult society, which is still around.
What's the name of it again?
The OTO. The Ordo Templi Orientis.
I mean,
and they still view themselves as the spiritual successors of Aleister Crowley. But when Parsons joined it in Los Angeles in 1939, it was a fairly small group of people, more or less on the fringes of the movie industry. But Parsons did that, and then Parsons became involved in magic, which meant you had to carry out magic operations, which in this case were basically summoning the goddess Babylon into reality. That's what he was trying to do. And the guy that he recruited to help him do that around 1946 was a recently discharged Navy lieutenant who was also curious about the occult.
Wow.
Lafayette Ronald Hubbard.
Ah.
So it was Jack Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard who went out to the Mojave Desert and hung around Pasadena trying to summon entities. Some people argue that all kinds of bad things happened because of that. Other people argue nothing happened because of that. What was the upshot of it? Hubbard stole Parsons' money and his girlfriend and ran off to Florida. That's what happened. So,
well, I mean, I knew there had to be some, because it was very similar, like the religious part, and I just thought there might be some connection.
Hubbard Hubbard always had to have an excuse. So if the argument, if the question ever came up later, why were you hanging out with that Crowleyite occultist Jack Parsons? Well, I was hanging out with him because the Navy, in this case, the American Naval Intelligence, assigned me to go there to figure out what Parsons was up to, because he was running a black magic cult that was trying to recruit physicists and other people at Caltech. Are they useful? Do they have sources of information? Do they have contacts? Do they have skills that are useful? And that's really how Crowley became involved. He wasn't recruited because anybody liked him. He was recruited because he had certain skills.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like he was very
skills, by the way, was being a pretty good actor.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounded like he can influence people very easily, and I'm sure that's very important.
That comes to another one of his little tricks: hypnotism.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he was fairly adept at that, and that actually has a lot of what goes in what is sort of popularly thought of as occultism is arguably a form of hypnotism.
I can see
rituals generally are a form of individual or mass hypnotism.
Is how did he where did it go? How did Crowley play a role in the sinking of the Lusitania? Okay,
well, here's how he thought he played a role. So
he thought. Excuse me.
It was a large British liner that early in the war, when America is neutral in May 1915, is torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. A lot of people drowned. Some of them were Americans. So a lot of people got pissed in America about the sinking of the Lusitania. So what Crowley later claimed, we can only give his view of this. I mean, the reason why the Lusitania was sunk, so far as I can see, is that it was in the wrong place at the wrong time. All right, because in this period in time, the way that you got sunk by a U-boat was that the U-boat just sort of would have to sort of pop up and you were there. Okay, yeah, it's bad luck. And unless, of course, there was magic involved, unless we get into that sort of creepy nether realm where things that just appear to be accidents aren't accidents. So that aside, here's what Crowley claimed. He was in America. He did, in fact, befriend and was befriended by German propagandists and agents in the United States. He did that. Okay. He did that. This is the story side. He did that basically through occult connections he had made in Germany. That's why he was taken into the confidence. So what Crowley claimed is that having been taken into the confidence of the Germans, having convinced them that he was essentially a turncoat Briton who was willing to work for them, he also tried to convince them that he had particular insights into the Anglo-Saxon mind. Okay, I don't know what that is. And here you go. What does that have to do with America? Well, let's, if we go back to 1917,
right.
Who pretty much ran America? Okay. the WASPs. Okay. So the Anglo-Saxon mind also sort of went over to the sort of American ruling class mentality. And he said, look, this is what you need to do. The question was, can we keep America neutral? The Germans wanted to keep America out of the war. The Brits wanted to bring America into the war. So the Germans in their meetings would say, well, Mr. Crowley, you've got insight into the Anglo-Saxon mind, into the American mind. What do you think is the right approach? A conciliatory approach, a kind of tough love approach? And here's what, again, he said he told them. So we're taking his word for it. He says, I told them that my study of the Americans indicated to me that the Americans are a childlike people. Okay? They are immature and they are easily frightened. And therefore, what Germany has to do is to be tough and to show that they're tough and determined. And that's why doing something like, sinking a liner, which, by the way, was carrying war supplies. That's why the Germans sunk it.
Right.
Which I might point out was quite legal in wartime. It was a liner. It
Right.
had people on it, but it was full of shells and war material. So yes, we can sink it, but it looks bad.
Right.
There's nothing like drowned women and children that tends to look bad. So and that was exactly, by the way, what the British wanted. So
they probably placed them on there for a reason.
To some degree, the British are setting the Lusitania up. They want it to be torpedoed because it will make the Germans look bad.
Right.
Well, Crowley said that's what I was doing. He said, look, I was proposing things that, and to paraphrase him, that only Germans would believe. And his idea was that he also had insight into their mentality, that they were insecure but also simultaneously arrogant, and that therefore by telling them that you should scare the Yankees by doing something bold, something tough, something like the Huns would do. Let's just sink an ocean liner. And that will keep them out of the war, because it will be like, well, the Germans are too terrible. We can't fight them. Look, they sank an ocean liner. They drowned babies. All right. And Crowley's idea was knowing all the time that it would have the opposite effect. So, did he actually tell the German propaganda cabinet that? Well, maybe. He said he did. We know they did this. They decided, with very arguments going back and forth, that yes, and the Germans made the Lusitania a target. They were bound and determined to sink it one way or the other, either with a submarine or putting a bomb on it when it was in port. So he got them to do arguably what it was they wanted to do anyway. By the way, for all of you out there who want to insidiously influence people, that's the way you do it. You simply get people to do what you've sensed they're inclined to do anyway. Then see, when they do it, it's all their fault.
I mean, the U.S. government has done this many times, weapons of mass destruction and many kinds of things that, to get us into a war or get us involved in other countries, so
tell them what they want to believe.
Yeah. Tell them what they want to believe.
And it's ridiculously easy once you do that. So I think Crowley is telling his version of the truth. He later would take credit, in his mind, he took credit for helping bring America into the war by convincing the Germans to do stupid, inflammatory things that would make the Yankees angry instead of scaring them. And so he would later argue that, I did my bit. And I think, whatever degree that actually was instrumental, that he believed that he had.
Say, the reason they're freaking out is because NASA is satanic. The origins of NASA are satanic. And I went, what? What are you talking about? And OMG, you guys, buckle up. What I'm about to tell you, you're not even going to believe me, but you can just research this. You don't even have to go down a dark hole on Reddit. You can just literally open Wikipedia. It is so in our faces, and yet we don't learn about this. And now I understand why they are very upset with me. So you may have heard of a man named Aleister Crowley. If you haven't, I'll provide you with some brief spark notes. Aleister Crowley was an Englishman. He was also a drug abuser. He was a bisexual who is credited with heavily influencing the eventual counterculture revolution of the 60s in America. Free love, free love. Yeah, that book, Chaos. Things got weird and satanic in the 60s in America. And America is where this Englishman, Aleister Crowley, eventually moved. But what he is most famous for is black magic. He was an occultist who pledged his allegiance to demons. He believed that he could summon demons, okay? The story goes that when he was 13 years old, he read the book of Revelation in the Bible, and he became inspired, not by Jesus Christ, but by the seven-headed beast that is ridden by the whore of Babylon. So in case you are somebody that's not familiar with the Bible and Revelations, they talk about this seven-headed beast that rules over every tribe and people and tongue and nation, okay? So it's satanic. It's a satanic beast. When Aleister got older, he started a religious cult, a satanic cult known as Thelema. Crowley believed that the number of the beast, 666, was significant. He believed that humanity was entering in a new eon and that his religious motto, which was do what thou wilt, would rule it, right? He believed that actually he could create this beast and rule over nations by practicing rituals. He routinely practiced sex rituals. He believed in masochistic and sadistic sex, believed in free love, and he was very much connected to the elite in America. He was just openly publishing articles for Vanity Fair because he was best friends with their editor, and many of the elite in our society were his followers and believers. A Satanist. This is a fact. You can look this up. One such follower was a man named Jack Parsons, another wealthy young man. And here's what you should know about this time period. Before Jack Parsons enters the scene in America, the scientific consensus was that we would never enter space, that was an impossibility. But this rich kid, who also happened to be an occultist and who also would perform sex rituals and blood sacrifice to summon demons, well, no, he expressed the belief that they could fundamentally alter humanity, and he had a vision. He said, no, we can make this work. We can get to space. Check out this article. Again, this is published. You can look this up yourself. Here's the headline: Sex, Rocket Science, and Satanism. Meet NASA's real hidden figures. And I'm going to read you directly from this article because it's so unbelievable. My jaw was on the floor. I'm skimming through it because it's way too long. It would make this show forever, but we will link it, and you absolutely must read it. It reads, quote, Jack Parsons is barely acknowledged on NASA's website, and he's the man who made rockets a reality and co-founded the agency's Jet Propulsion Lab, JPL, home to missions which paved the way for the Apollo programs and continue to explore Mars and outer space today. If Parsons' life story was a film script, it would be dubbed preposterous. He invented jet propulsion technology in the face of industry-wide derision that rockets would never exist, but was also a senior figure in the occult and invited L. Ron Hubbard, yes, L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology, into his confidence and riotous sex parties. Parsons tried to sell his government-funded inventions to Israel before winding up dying at the age of 37 in a self-created explosion, leaving a mass of disturbing materials for his friends to discover. Here's the remarkably twisting tale of his life. So he too, like Aleister Crowley, was just interested in the demonic when he was young. He also liked science fiction. His story begins when he's 14 years old. And as a fan of science fiction, he decides to begin experiments that would eventually shape his life with his school friend named Edward Foreman. The pair took to playing with rockets in Parsons' back garden and soon created their own solid-fueled rockets. It was here that Jack would begin to link science with Satanism. Parsons later claimed he first summoned the devil at age 13 in a terrifying experience. Jack and Ed would later attend and then drop out of college. In 1936, they met a 22-year-old Frank Molina, who was a grad student who shared their passion for defying gravity. When Parsons and Molina met, their enthusiasm for rocketry and space travel bonded them like a Masonic handshake, one writer says. I'm sure it did. Molina helped by getting their research funded by Caltech, and their experiments were quite dangerous. There were a lot of explosions. And so he and his friends became known as the Suicide Squad. They decided to move their experiments into the desert, and this part is just amazing. I'm going to read you a direct quotation here. Once again, Jack's fascinations with the occult and rocketry collided. In the desert lands outside of Caltech, there is a former river channel called Arroyo Seco. It is flanked on both sides by rock, one of which is called Devil's Gate, thanks to its shape of a horned head. Some locals believed the mouth of Arroyo Seco was a portal to other dimensions. But for Parsons, the area had two uses. He tested rockets there, but years later, he would return to conduct ceremonies and rituals with other occultists in the same spot. By golly, guys, what then happens is that on Halloween of all nights in 1936, they have a scientific breakthrough after they accidentally set fire to the oxygen line of their small rocket motor. And although it didn't launch, Molina and his team were enthused. They said this test was successful. He wrote to his parents, and NASA would later consider that experiment, which happened again on Halloween, to be the first rocket experiment of what would later become the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So there was a method to the Suicide Squad's madness. They had created a fuel that would burn cleanly and be stored without exploding. And the scientific community was skeptical, but the U.S. Army saw potential and they offered to fund the Trios project in 1939. So great. Satanic little cult meets the United States government. Thereafter, Jack's credibility in the scientific community soared, and so did his interest in the supernatural and the demonic. He was taken to a meeting of OTO, which stands for the Order of Templi Orientis, an occult society in Los Angeles in 1939, and he became fully engrossed. If you're wondering what OTO is, it was a group that was formed by and followed the teachings of Aleister Crowley. Again, the heroin-addicted sexual deviant and occultist who was considered the wickedest man in the world by the press in his native England. Parsons went from just reading Crowley's writings to becoming the Beast 666's pen pal. Within a few years, Crowley considered Parsons his American protege. Parsons was barely in his mid-20s, and he was not at all concerned with keeping his personal and professional proclivities separate. The article tells us that the California Tech ran stories at the time that reported that he chanted Crowley's hymn before he lit his rockets. They're just chanting satanic, demonic hymns before they lit these rockets, guys. This is not a joke. This is not a test. This is history that is hiding right under your nose. By 1941, he and his wife, Helen, who he had married 5 years earlier, were indicted into what was known as the Agape Lodge, which was a branch of the church which practiced Crowley's religion of Thelemic magic. Then they came into money. They founded the Aerojet Engineering Corporation, which became the world's largest manufacturer of rockets and propellants. And within 20 years, it had become a $700 million a year business. Parsons was the vice president. A year later, he co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. So now that he's rich, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? You've got government contacts, you've got money, you're having sex rituals. Well, he just is going to make the whole demonic sex rituals bigger because obviously it has led to success, summoning demons, believing in Satan. And what he did next was he took out a lease on a mansion in Pasadena's Millionaires Row on Orange Grove Avenue and invited fellow Thelemites to live communally in what was known as the parsonage. This is really kind of the earliest iteration of a hippie commune, if you ask me. And of course, if you've read that book, Chaos, you just are going, OMG, Candace. So what did they do at the parsonage? Well, the parsonage had 10 bedrooms, but its greatest asset, for Parsons at least, according to this article, was its additional 3-bedroom coach house, which became an Agape Lodge. The commune was self-sufficient, maintaining allotments and livestock to eat and use for blood rituals. Those were the tame events. The blood rituals were the tame events that unfolded at the parsonage. The residents of the Orange Grove made frequent complaints to the police about loud music, drug taking, and the naked pregnant women that were dancing through fire in the garden. This is totally normal stuff, guys. It's just, coming up with NASA and jet propulsion, you sometimes got to have a naked pregnant woman dancing in the garden through fire. Parsons would greet people at the door with a live snake wrapped around his shoulders. And when the police would turn up, he would tell them, hey, look, I'm a Caltech scientist. There's no trouble going on here. I'm connected. I'm connected to the government. I've got money. You leave me alone. And I guess they just left him alone. Somehow this is going to get creepier, guys, because in the mid-40s, Jack decided that he wanted to push the barriers of his Satanism a little more, pushing the barriers of Thelemic magic to a new level. He wanted to take the spirit of Babylon, the goddess that they worshipped, and instill it into a human being. In short, he wanted to impregnate a woman that he believed to have certain powers, so that she would give birth to a child that would embody the forces of Babylon. So between January and March of 1946, yep, we're coming now to the end of World War II. So think about what Tucker said. Hubbard, again, that's L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology, assisted Parsons in a series of rituals that they called Babylon working. And on January 18th, a woman named Marjorie Cameron, who had red hair, turned up at the parsonage, and he believed that this is it. This is the Scarlet Woman that he had called forth via his rituals. The moment had arrived. It is done, Parsons told Hubbard. I returned home and found a young woman answering the requirements waiting for me. I thought I had the most morbid imaginations, but it seems I have not. If you're wondering who that redheaded woman was, she was a woman that had been recently discharged from the Navy. She had a free spirit. She happened to have red hair. She was happy to have sex with Parsons. Because, again, they promoted free love. Hubbard was then promoted to a position of high priesthood mere weeks after being exposed to the Thelemic black magic, and he incanted rite and ritual. Some of it he did completely off of the cuff. What was the result? Well, afterwards, on March 6th, Parsons wrote enthusiastically to Aleister Crowley. He wrote, quote, I can hardly tell you or decide how much I want to write. I am under command of extreme secrecy. I have had the most important, devastating experience of my life. Crowley responded to him, writing, quote, you have me completely puzzled by your remark. I thought I had the most morbid imagination, but it seems I have not. I cannot form the slightest idea what you can possibly mean. Well, what Parsons meant was he had created a moon child. That's what they were trying to create, a moon child as their final experiment, creating a child of Babylon. The ending of the story, by the way, which we're coming to, gets a little bit shady. They say that apparently after all of that, after impregnating this woman, after chanting after the sex rituals, after driving this woman forth, that she agreed to have an abortion. Parsons then came under the investigation of the FBI. They believe that he had been planning to give his rocket plans to the newly founded Israeli government in exchange for admission to the country and the chance of a new life abroad. Then he died rather mysteriously, Jack Parsons, in an explosion. Some claim he was suicided. Some claim that it was an accident. Some claim that he never died and actually he just disappeared. Honestly, we'll never know. This book is entitled Hollywood Babylon. It is written by somebody named Kenneth Anger. And I will tell you who Kenneth Anger was just based off of his Wikipedia. He was an American underground experimental filmmaker, an actor, and a writer, working exclusively in short films. He produced almost 40 works beginning in 1937. Anger's films variously merged surrealism with homoeroticism and the occult. He himself was an occultist. He considered himself fascinated with Aleister Crowley. So anyways, getting into this book, you're not going to believe this. I guess I'll ask you a question here. What could be in a book or in a conversation that would warrant it getting banned? Why was my conversation with Kanye banned? Why was any conversation with Kanye banned in 2022? Now that you listen to the conversation, you're like, well, that wasn't a crazy conversation. The media had me thinking he was just like hyped up. Why weren't we allowed to listen to Kanye speak? Why, similarly, when this book was published in 1965 in America, was this book banned? They took it off the shelves. This is blowing my mind, by the way, because I can't even figure out how they did that legally. Like, this is America. You can't just ban books. But apparently this book got banned, okay? Kenneth Anger writes this book called Hollywood Babylon, and it gets banned, and it's not allowed to go into print again until 1975 in America. So when I wanted to get my hands on this, having come across it in some of my researching, I had to have Savannah, my manager, get a copy of it on eBay, like somebody who was selling. That's why it's all beat up, because it's from a very long time ago. And now I know why this book is banned. Now I understand why the Kanye conversation was banned. It's because if there is a truth that is being hidden, the best way to get rid of it is to simply tell people, just to sensationalize it, right? Like I said, yellow journalism. It's crazy. This is far out there. Well, this book from a Hollywood insider is absolutely shocking. And I just wanted to read you some portions of it, because I suspect that many of you guys will be trying to get your hands on a copy of it on eBay soon. But, it just tells the story of how Hollywood was actually established. And I don't think that that's something that many of us think about. We just assume, I don't know, Hollywood was always there. I don't know what we think. We don't think about it because really the golden age of Hollywood was the 1920s. And none of us, or at least not many of us, I don't think any of us, were alive in the 1920s. And so we just accept that motion pictures became a thing somehow. And maybe in our mind, we don't recognize that so much debauchery took place, that essentially these were the carnival people that just realized they could make money by creating all of these characters. But what he establishes in this book, Kenneth Anger, is that the intention of creating Hollywood was to create a sort of demonic religion. So I'm just going to read you about even how they were naming the theaters at the time cathedrals, like this inverse again of religion. So he's talking about how people were racing at this time to cathedrals. And he writes, one more stupefying picture than the next sprung up in cities across the land to accommodate the well-heeled faithful. The multitudes flocked to the darkened temples where the flickering shadows danced, fleeting visions of erotic and exciting deities born through the somehow wicked and wonderful darkness on a lush groundswell from a symphony orchestra. They were wander sanctuaries where millions worshipped from the depths of lodges. Their idols on the Argentine altar on high were huge, disembodied countenances of awesome gods and adorable goddesses matched their marcelled pastel profiles while mounting mute, blessedly inaudible nothings. All over the world, this novel and pagan religion flowered and left its offerings before crossing the sacred precinct. This religion, enormously lucrative for its perpetrators, as cynical as they were shameless, was just old, heathen, hedonistic body worship, dolled up in a new disguise, the adoration of the stars of Hollywood, USA. It was an illusion, a tease, a fraud. It was almost as much fun as the old-time religion, without blood on the altars, but the blood would come. He then talks about, the star worship of the heavenly bodies began when the flickering figures doffed their anonymity, creating all of these characters, Charlie Chaplin, all of them having names that were not actually their names. Never have so few, for the Hollywood stars of the first magnitude were never more than a select few, a charmed circle, furnished masturbation fodder for so many. No other religion can make that statement. Okay, I hate to interrupt again, but I have to tell you guys about American financing. I know the stress, the economic stress that so many people are going through right now, feeling like you are constantly having to put your expenses on a credit card, which obviously only increases the stress because you're trying to find a way out of the never-ending cycle of debt. Well, here's something you can do. You can call my friends at American Financing. They're helping people just like you turn things around by using the equity in their homes to pay off high-interest debt. They understand what you're going through, and they talk to people in your position every single day. American Financing is saving their borrowers an average of $854 a month, which when you total it comes to effectively a $10,000 a year raise. And if you want to get started, you may not even have to pay next month's mortgage payment if you call them today. There is no better time than right now to turn your situation around. So call 800-795-1210. That's 800-795-1210. Or you can visit AmericanFinancing.net/Owens. Again, that's AmericanFinancing.net/Owens. So you get onto this book, he starts telling you the stories, and you realize, and when he says about blood sacrifice, and he starts speaking about what was going on in Hollywood in the 20s, that essentially this book was banned because he just spelled out how actors and actresses were being murdered. And they were being murdered. There were plots with their lawyers, their agents, essentially exactly what Michael Jackson and Ye were trying to communicate, that there is essentially a gang and a cabal in Hollywood They've always been there. In fact, these agents and these lawyers sprang up out of literal gangs. Like, these were dope dealers that then became agents, that then became owners of motion pictures, who were killing each other and killing actors and actresses who were trying to get out. It tells various stories, but there's just two of them that I actually wanted to bring to your attention because I think they're really relevant. The first is of this young actress named Olive Thomas. I mean, this girl was 20 years old, and she was known as a person who had her life together. She had a squeaky clean image. And then one night in France, she's just found dead in her bed. She was holding, when the person knocked on the door, when the valet opened the door, she was holding tightly to a bottle of very deadly bichloride of mercury tablets. The suite was registered in the name of Mrs. Jack Pickford, known to millions of adoring fans as the bright young star of the American screen, Olive Thomas. Okay. So she gets killed, and it's heavily implied here that she was killed, and they tried to make it look like an overdose, and the public didn't believe that it was an overdose. So they then took to yellow journalism about her and began making up stories, just salacious stories, accusing her of having a drug addiction with absolutely no proof. And the public was shocked by this. Like, how could this innocent girl who we've come to love on our screens, you're telling us that she was secretly a drug addict? And it worked. Every single time they did this form of yellow journalism, when they wanted people to look the other way and not to believe that something criminal had taken place, they would just suddenly say that the stars were either drug addicts or they were crazy. Just repeat this over and over again. No, we don't need to peddle in conspiracy theory, because in this story, truth is stranger than fiction.